The SOW. Let's get it. We are diving deep into the world of true crime on YouTube, a genre that's, it's exploding in popularity, but also facing some serious ethical questions.
Definitely.
We've got two YouTube videos to kind of help us unpack all this. Pine Lee's critical look at trends in true crime, and Daishi Nisa's really passionate take on the responsibility that comes with telling these stories. So get ready to explore where entertainment ends and exploitation begins in the world of true crime.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating landscape right now. I think one of the things that's really striking is just how many women are drawn to true crime. Pine Lee points out that over 70% of true crime podcast listeners are female. And there are a lot of different theories about why that is. Some people argue it's a way for women to feel more prepared and empowered, especially, in a world where they're statistically more likely to be victims of violence. Others suggest it's more about a fascination with the psychology of crime, this kind of desire to understand what drives people to commit these really horrific acts.
And I think there's no denying that true crime content can have some positive impacts. Like in Pine Lee's video, he shares a bunch of comments from a Reddit thread where people are talking about how true crime actually made them more aware of their surroundings and, taught them personal safety tips.
Right, and in some rare cases, true crime content has even helped solve cold cases. The Robert Durst case is a really good example of that. The documentary The Jinx brought so much renewed attention to the case. And Durst's own words, which were captured on a hot mic, ultimately contributed to his conviction.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing how a documentary can have such real-world consequences like that. But of course, there's a flip side to all of this. Pine Lee highlights the story of Mindy Pendleton, whose stepson's murder was featured in that Netflix series I Am a Killer. And the family was completely against the series. They felt it exploited their tragedy and even glorified the murderer.
Yeah, and it really raises some serious questions about consent and the responsibility that content creators have to the victims' families. Pine Lee also talks about the Shannon Watts family, who faced a ton of online harassment. After their story was featured in some true crime content, they were bombarded with messages and theories. It really turned their personal tragedy into this public spectacle.
It's a good reminder that these stories involve real people, whose lives have been irrevocably changed by these events. And something that really stood out to me in Pine Lee's video was just how many examples he showed of clickbait titles and thumbnails. It's clear that some creators are prioritizing sensationalism and shock value over respect for the victims. You see these overly dramatic images, phrases like unbelievable twist or you won't believe what happened next, all designed to just grab your attention and get those clicks.
Yeah, and the problem is that this type of sensationalism can really re-traumatize victims' families, forcing them to relive their worst nightmares over and over again. And it also fosters this culture of speculation and judgment, where these online sleuths are dissecting every detail, often, without having all the facts.
And then there's this whole trend of combining true crime with makeup tutorials and mukbangs. Bailey Sarian with her murder mystery makeup series is probably the most well-known example. She'll be applying eyeshadow and then casually drop some horrifying detail about a murder case.
Yeah, it's a very specific aesthetic. And Pine Lee features a clip from one of Stephanie Sue's videos, where she's discussing this particularly gruesome aspect of a case while asking for teriyaki sauce.
It's a jarring combination, to say the least. Some people argue that it's harmless entertainment. They say it's just multitasking. People do their makeup and eat while listening to podcasts. So why not true crime videos?
Right, but critics argue that it trivializes the gravity of these crimes. Like, death and violence shouldn't just be background noise while you're, doing your makeup or enjoying a meal. It feels disrespectful to the victims and their families to treat their stories as this kind of casual entertainment. And it also raises questions about how this type of content might desensitize us to violence and suffering.
It's definitely a complex issue with strong arguments on both sides. But even more disturbing, in my opinion, is the trend of romanticizing killers. These are real people who have committed horrific acts, yet some creators portray them in this sympathetic light, almost like tragic heroes.
Yeah. Pine Lee analyzes a video by Danielle Cursity where she discusses this double murderer with a level of sympathy that's honestly kind of unsettling. And the comments on the video are even more disturbing. You see viewers expressing pity for the killer, making excuses for their actions, and even getting angry at the victims.
It's like they've completely lost sight of the fact that these are real people who have caused immense pain and suffering. And this romanticization is particularly dangerous because it can lead to a warped perception of justice and accountability.
Daisha Unique brings up a really important point in her video. She talks about Ariana Grande's comment expressing interest in meeting Jeffrey Dahmer and the huge outrage that it sparked among victims' families. Dahmer was a cannibalistic serial killer, and to express admiration for someone like that is incredibly insensitive.
Yeah, Daisha makes a powerful comparison. She asks us to imagine if people were romanticizing school shooters
Mm.
or the Las Vegas shooter in the same way. And it immediately highlights the absurdity of glamorizing violence
Hmm.
and those who perpetuate it.
Right, it forces you to confront that double standard
Oh,
and to really think about the messages we're sending when we choose to focus on the killer story rather than the victims.
exactly.
Yeah, it's like we're forgetting that these are not characters in a fictional story.
Yeah.
These are real people whose lives were tragically cut short and their families are left to deal with this unimaginable pain.
And I think that's where this whole makeup and mukbang trend becomes especially problematic. It's not just the juxtaposition of, those activities with true crime, but the tone that some creators adopt. It's almost flippant, like they're gossiping about celebrities instead of discussing real tragedy.
Exactly. Pinely shows a clip from one of Bailey Sarian's videos where she's describing this really gruesome murder, and then she makes a joke about it feels so jarring and disrespectful, like she's trying to lighten the mood with humor when the subject matter demands a much more somber tone.
Yeah, and then you have Stephanie Sue talking about a victim's unborn child in this really casual, almost dismissive way. It's like, oh, and by the way, this horrible thing happened to this innocent person, but let's move on to what I'm having for dinner.
It's incredibly insensitive, and let's not forget the sponsorships. You've got these creators promoting products and brands in the middle of discussing these horrific crimes. It feels exploitative on multiple levels. They're profiting from these stories, often without the consent of the victims' families, and then they're layering on this commercial aspect that just feels so out of place.
It's like, hey, while you're learning about this brutal murder, why not try this new teeth whitening kit? It's such a strange and uncomfortable mix.
What's interesting is that Pinely acknowledges that a lot of these creators are talented entertainers.
Hmm.
He points out that Bailey Sarian, for instance, is funny, charismatic, she's skilled at makeup, but talent doesn't excuse the ethical concerns surrounding the content.
Right. It's not about, attacking someone's personality or their talent. It's
Yeah.
about recognizing the responsibility that comes with having a platform and discussing these really sensitive topics like murder and violence.
Yeah. Pinely argues that creators have a responsibility to be more mindful of their presentation, their tone, the potential impact that their content can have on viewers, especially considering how easily influenced people can be by the way a story is presented.
He uses the example of that Netflix documentary, Tiger King, and how the editing arguably manipulated viewers' perceptions of Carol Baskin.
Mhm.
It's a reminder that even seemingly objective documentaries can use these subtle techniques to kind of shape the narrative. And when you're dealing with true crime where real lives are involved, that kind of manipulation can be incredibly damaging.
Absolutely. It's crucial to remember that these stories have real-world consequences for the victims' families, and sensationalizing them for entertainment can inflict further pain and trauma.
So circling back to the future of true crime content, what are some potential solutions? How can we enjoy this genre without contributing to the exploitation and sensationalism?
Well, I think it starts with awareness. We as consumers need to be more critical of the content we consume. We need to ask ourselves, is this creator being respectful of the victims? Are they prioritizing accuracy over sensationalism? Are they profiting from this tragedy without giving back to the affected communities?
And maybe we need to be more mindful of our own consumption habits. Do we really need to watch a true crime video while we're doing our makeup or having dinner? Could we dedicate some focused time to engage with these stories in a more thoughtful and respectful way?
I think that's a great point. It's about treating these stories with the gravity they deserve, not consuming them as a form of background entertainment.
Pinely mentions a YouTuber named Kendall Ray who often collaborates with victims' families and gives them a platform to share their stories in their own words. That seems like a much more responsible approach to true crime content.
It is. It's about centering the voices of those most affected by these tragedies rather than exploiting their pain for views and clicks. And it's about using these platforms to raise awareness and advocate for positive change.
Daisha Unique also raises an interesting point about the true crime community giving a platform to people like Gypsy Rose Blanchard.
Yes, the case of Gypsy Rose and her mother, Dee Dee, is fascinating. But Daisha argues that we shouldn't be celebrating Gypsy as some kind of folk hero. She manipulated someone into killing her mother, and while her situation was undoubtedly complex and tragic, it's important to acknowledge the gravity of her actions.
And that ties into this larger conversation about accountability and responsibility. We can't just blindly celebrate anyone who's been through trauma or hardship. We need to hold people accountable for their choices, even while acknowledging the systemic factors that may have contributed to their circumstances.
Absolutely. It's about nuanced thinking, recognizing that there are often multiple layers to these stories and avoiding these simplistic narratives that either demonize or glorify individuals.
It feels like we're at this turning point with true crime. The genre's popularity is undeniable, but we're also becoming more aware of the ethical pitfalls.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's a powerful genre. There's no doubt about that. It can educate, it can advocate, it can even bring some sense of closure or justice in some cases. But it's a double-edged sword, you know? We need to wield it carefully, with empathy and respect for the victims and their families.
Yeah, and so much of this comes down to the choices we make as consumers. We have the power to support creators who are doing it right,
Yeah.
the ones who prioritize the human element over sensationalism.
Exactly. And we also have the power to hold creators accountable. You know, we can call out exploitation, we can challenge biased narratives, and we can demand better from the content that we consume.
And it all comes back to that question that Daisha Unique asks so powerfully. Imagine if it were your loved one whose story was being told. Would you want their life reduced to clickbait headlines and gruesome details served up alongside a mukbang?
That's a really powerful image, and it's the question we should all be asking ourselves before we hit that play button. We need to remember that these aren't just stories, they're real lives, real tragedies. And our engagement with them should reflect that.
So to all our listeners out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the complex world of true crime content. We hope this conversation has challenged you to think more critically about this genre and the impact it has on both creators and consumers.
Yeah, and remember, true crime can be both captivating and compassionate. So choose your content wisely, engage thoughtfully, and never lose sight of the human stories at the heart of these cases.
And if you enjoyed this deep dive, be sure to hit that subscribe button and leave us a comment with your thoughts. And as always, thanks for listening to VSOW.